more outward-looking responsibilities.
So the Prime Minister can never have both.
The Prime Minister well, now let me get to that. Now, in the first scenario, you got the President as both.
Right.
In the second scenario, where the Prime Minister's party wins or the Prime Minister gets elected from a coalition of parties, the Prime Minister is really more the head of the government, meaning the more powerful spot.
Okay.
Now, when you think about Russia, and we're still trying to figure out what's going on to a certain extent over there, when Putin stepped down as president and became prime minister, there is a sense that maybe he could become both as prime minister.
Right.
And that's kind of what they're suggesting there in the grand scheme of things. What's that?
Is Russia going to be in that?
Not really. We've just mentioned it briefly.
Okay.
But if you were to wow me with that in a short answer, then that would certainly help you with some points. Okay? So anyway, go ahead. What do you got, Ben?
Constructive no confidence.
Constructive no
German.
confidence. Okay, what is a vote of no confidence as you learned about it from the last chapter? The last exam.
When the Parliament in England votes on whether they want the president to have his election now, or whether Prime Minister to have his election now, or whether they want to wait.
Okay, the vote of no confidence basically comes down, and it could be a specific measure or it could just be a regular bill. And when they have one of these, if the Prime Minister's party doesn't pass their bill, or if the opposition party raises this up, then indeed they can actually basically remove the Prime Minister, call for new elections, and they'll start all over.
Just like Britain right now.
Yeah, exactly. Now the funny thing in Britain, and just to kind of talk about this, we've been talking a little bit about the whole idea that they had their debates. Britain is having, and we didn't use this term, because I don't want to get too far off track, but the term is a hung parliament. And we haven't used this yet. So if your parliament is hung, what that means is that actually one party does not get the majority. And so what it effectively means is that Britain right now, there's a sense that David Cameron, that guy who was the fiery opposition leader, might actually become prime minister, or the two parties that he's actually technically beaten might join together and form a majority, which is something that basically never happens in Britain, has not happened in decades. Now, for our purposes, the constructive no confidence. Okay, if no confidence means that Parliament can throw it out, it's always easier to tear something down. What does the constructive part mean in that vote of no confidence?
You have to have a replacement.
You have to have a replacement. So the idea, say, in Germany with a constructive vote of no confidence is you're not just going to tear down the government. You're actually going to have a replacement leader and a replacement cabinet in mind. And it's easy sometimes to just tear it up. But the sense is that if you've actually got to replace the one that you're throwing out, that makes it much, much harder, and it makes a more stable executive, a more stable government, a more powerful prime minister, chancellor type person. Go ahead, Andrew.
So the main difference then between constructive no confidence and just no confidence is the fact that constructive has a backup plan, essentially.
Yeah, they have a replacement plan. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. They already know who's going to take over. And I guess in some instances you kind of already know in the other system too, but in the big picture of things, it's immediate. You know, we know this is the way it's going to be. If these are the folks that are going right in, bam, they're there. Go ahead, Brandon.
So if there's a vote of no confidence, like removing the prime minister, how come it's not always constructive no confidence? If you're removing him, you don't have a replacement ready?
Well, okay, that's just it. I mean, the sense, remember, I believe the chapter was talking about Italy, and I believe we brought up Italy and how Italy has had so many different governments.
Yeah.
If every time you just voted somebody out like Italy does, and they only last a few months, or it's maybe 3 in every 4 years or something like this, you're removing somebody, which could be constructive, but they don't get time to do anything. You see what I mean? So it's always happening, it's always happening, it's always happening.
Sometimes it's just too fast.
Well, in that instance, it's just the confidence vote. But the constructive part is that you know the next person that's coming in immediately right at that point. And if you don't know, then the sitting government that might be unpopular gets more time to try and fix things. If you do know, then you get that next group in. But it's easy to be against something, but it's harder for everybody to come back together in favor of it. So they call it constructive because when you've got that replacement, number one, they're already going to have their majority. They already know who's coming in. It's more stable. And two, if it's not constructive in Germany, then there's not a vote of confidence because they don't have the replacement there. So it means the existing one is more powerful, even if they're a little bit unpopular. Go ahead.
Cohabitation.
What was cohabitation? Go ahead.
What's when two people of two different sexes live in the same house?
So if you lived with Ben, that would be cohabitation.
I guess that's what you meant by it.
Or is it just two people?
Two people.
It's two
So if
unmarried
you lived
people.
with Ariel, that would be cohabitation.
Technically, yes.
So if you lived with Julia, that would be in a place other than Massachusetts, say. That would be,
Wouldn't it be?
or and Canada. Okay. Okay. Cohabitate. Go ahead,
No,
Brendan.
I thought it was if they're not married.
Yeah.
Two people of the opposite
Yeah, I
sex
was
if they're
thinking
not
they're
married.
not.
Yeah. The idea is you're going to have two different. Go ahead, Andrew.
When you mentioned it, weren't you referring to the French hybrid system?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that's exactly what it was. Cohabitation basically literally means that the two people of different sex that aren't married basically are shacking up, if you will. And I guess, Ariel, you could cohabitate with Julia. I mean, what's that?
Marriage is legal in France, so.
That's true.
So,
Okay, all right.
so it would.
So yeah, it could work. It could work. But this may have occurred prior to gay marriage becoming legal over there. Point is, for our purposes in the hybrid system, if you cohabitated, and I do remember asking if somebody in class, I can't remember who,
Blanca.
had cohabitated. Blanca had cohabitated.
No, she hadn't. You asked, but she
Okay,
hadn't.
all right. And for our purposes in the French system, when one party wins the majority of the parliament and the other party is actually represented by the presidency, that is cohabitation under the hybrid system. And the effect of it is if we're talking about different genders living together, we're talking about different parties trying to govern together in the hybrid system. And that's actually fairly a common occurrence. In the U.S., believe it or not, the Democrats and the Republicans cohabitate too, but in the U.S. system, we just call it gridlock, if you remember. If, you know, the different parties, but gridlock kind of implies that they're not getting anything done. Cohabitation doesn't necessarily mean that they're not getting anything done. So that's what cohabitation was. Term limits. The big thing, if you remember, with term limits, does the Prime Minister have a term limit? Does the Prime Minister have a specific term?
Yes.
He has.
Okay, I got yeses and nos. Go ahead, Andrew.
Doesn't he have a 5-year term, and he can call for when he wants the re-election to occur?
Yeah. See, this is the thing, and term limit is kind of one of those funny words, because in the American context, we think about a term limit as basically saying you can get elected twice, and then you can't get elected anymore. So you could get elected president and re-elected, and then you're done. In the executive chapter, when they're talking about term limits, there's two ways of looking at this. In some countries out there, presidents and prime ministers both can be elected and elected and elected as long as they can continue to get the votes. Meaning some of them are going to have been in office for 20 years, 30 years, maybe even 35 years sometimes. So when you think about it, there aren't term limits like you would consider in the United States. But Andrew, to your point, the other thing about the term limit, and this kind of ties in with the First Tuesday reference. What was the First Tuesday reference?
Isn't that when elections are? No, they're
Yeah, what is the specific reference? When are American elections?
They're on the first Tuesday following the first Monday.
That's right. American elections are the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November. First Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So when you put this into context, when you think about term limits,